Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Age Group Triathlon podcast. My name is Simon Olney, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and this week I'm here to talk to you about the risk-reward ratio in triathlon. Now, this is sort of a sliding scale essentially between whether something is risky enough to be worthwhile and whether the reward justifies the risk. Now, this applies to, I think, just about every walk of life, really. You have to ask yourself whether the risk that you're taking is worth the reward, and equally whether any potential reward is worth the risk. It really does go both ways. So, to use an example, I don't know much about stock trading, but a number of you I know will. So if somebody were to put money into something like the S&P 500 or Apple, which is a really safe place to put your money, and you know that you are going to make money in the long term, yeah, that's a safe investment, but the reward isn't amazingly high. Whereas if you were to invest a lot of money into a startup, there is a chance you could make an astronomical amount of money. However, the risk is also really high because the number of startups who do that are infinitesimal. It is a tiny amount. The same applies at work. If you go for a promotion, you might get it, you might not. If you don't get that promotion, that can cause, there can be political kind of kickbacks from that. You could be the person who tried to go for that job and didn't get it. Equally, if you never go for any promotions, if you never apply for other positions within the company or elsewhere, you're never really going to change anything much about your career. There's a good chance you'll end up in that same role forever. So you really do need to look at this through the eyes of, this is just part of life, us making these calculated decisions. But I'm going to be talking you through a few examples in triathlon. Now, I'm going to start by talking in broad strokes, broad concepts of what we might consider high risk, high reward and the like. And then I'm going to dial down into all of the individual sports and also looking at racing and where I think it is absolutely worth taking these risks for the reward available and where it's really just better holding back. To start off with, let's look at it in the simplest of terms. What is a high risk session? Broadly speaking, a high risk session is one that carries the risk of injury, is probably the biggest one, or a huge level of perhaps muscle soreness could be another sort of high risk, as well as maybe a really big volume week, so one that is really hard. The risks in triathlon will often be about getting an injury or, getting to that state of non-functional overreaching where we're absolutely exhausted and drained, and that can throw off our training. But if we never take any risks, then we're never going to come close to achieving our potential. If we look at running, for an example, if I were to prescribe an athlete a 20-minute easy run, okay, for most athletes, that's going to carry an extremely low risk. What could possibly go wrong there? But it's also going to carry an extremely low reward as well. Great, you did 20 minutes easy. I'm not sure that's going to have much of an effect on your fitness at all, apart from just, keeping your body sort of locked in, memorising the movement patterns, having those muscles sort of turn over. It can be worth doing if you are really looking to improve your running and you say, I'm going to do 20 minutes each day in addition to the rest of my training. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. But the rewards that are on offer are relatively low for it as an individual session in isolation. Now, if we take a sprint workout as an example, so if somebody is doing a series of 100-meter sprints, okay, that is a high-risk session. The chances of somebody injuring, especially their hamstring, the chances of it setting off, an Achilles issue, anything like that, it is a lot higher than other sessions, especially if somebody isn't used to that work. But the rewards of doing a session like that are immense. Now, don't get me wrong, we don't do many 100-meter sprints as triathletes, especially, age group triathletes. You're never going to have to drive for the line in the same way that a professional might. However, What it will do is it will remind our body of the proper form for running, so that we can just be an awful lot more efficient with the rest of our running. It helps improve our biomechanics, it helps our brains sort of make these connections. So the motor units improve our neuromuscular system to make us more efficient athletes. Okay, there are a lot of gains to come from a sprint session, but we do need to sprinkle them in carefully. We need to make sure the athlete is fresh, and we need to make sure it is conclusive with somebody's current goals, their strengths and their weaknesses. If somebody is really good over short distances and they want to do a sprint session every week, that's just their ego telling them they want to do that. They want to see themselves get, 0.25 seconds faster over 100 meters. And you know what? I get it. It's nice to see these improvements across sport. But if you're training for a 10-kilometer race, how much of an impact is that really going to have? However, it's not just the explosive, high-intensity sessions that come with the risk of injury. It's also the really long sessions, especially in the run, and especially if you decide that you really want to jack up the volume. So if we take an athlete, for instance, who signed up for an Ironman, and they've been really procrastinating with their training, there's always an excuse they can find. There's always a way they can justify not doing a session. And then they get about 6 weeks out from their event and they go, oh my God, I don't think I can do this. And then find themselves in a state where they decide they need to panic train. And, they've never run more than 15 kilometers before, but they decide that they're going to go out and they're going to do a 30-kilometer run. Because, that's what's going to help them get ready for the Ironman, right? Now, this is a high risk but low reward session. If somebody were to go out and to do 30 kilometers completely untrained, okay, they may be able to get through it fine. I mean, let's face it, there's going to be probably some walking breaks, it's going to be slow, it's not going to be pretty, but if all they really wanted to do was get this 30-kilometer run done, then yes, they will have that confidence boost of knowing they can do that. But the actual physiological benefits of the body adapting to that session aren't going to be as large as you might think, because it's going to be so overloaded, which can actually sometimes interfere with the adaptation effect, especially if all of the other recovery pillars aren't in place. The main benefit will be to somebody's confidence. And don't get me wrong, your headspace, your confidence, it is an important part of this. However, what we can't afford to do is to let our sense of kind of not necessarily ego, but just let our brain get in the way of what's actually going to be good for our body, and go, look, if I go out and I really hurt my body because my brain just wanted this sense of confidence, that's not really going to set you up. And if somebody does a 30-kilometer run 6 weeks out from a triathlon, which is double what they've done before, I say the chances of them picking up an injury between then and their Ironman probably going to sit somewhere between the 70 and 80% range. It's just going to be so much overload on the body. Muscles are going to be super fatigued. You're going to have stabilizing muscles that are completely going to give out, and that's going to really send your running form down a very certain river without a paddle. And it's just going to have a net negative impact on your triathlon performance. Now, a few of you who are regular listeners may know that my opinion on the pre Ironman marathon is it's not my favourite thing for athletes to do. Again, this is something that is low reward. You're not really going to get a huge amount fitter by putting this pre-Ironman marathon in, but what you are going to do is you are going to increase your risk of injury relatively significantly. But equally to these high-risk sessions with low reward, we have plenty of low-risk sessions with a very high reward. That sounds great, doesn't it? And the low-risk sessions with the high reward for triathletes are, generally speaking, the longer, easier sessions. Preparing for an Ironman, go out for a 5-hour ride. What are the chances of somebody hurting or injuring themselves on that ride? I mean, they're no lower or higher than any other ride, really. They're just putting in the miles. But the benefits that's going to give to your fitness, assuming that you have built up through, you started off with, let's say, a 2.5 hour long ride and you've added 10-15 minutes onto your long rides most weeks up until this point, and you get to the point where you're doing 5.5, 6 hour long rides, it's going to have a huge boost to your aerobic fitness, which at the end of the day is what Ironman is all about. It's all about aerobic fitness from a performance standpoint, at least. When it comes to actually finishing the race, that's a little bit different, but I'm not going to go into that today. So the benefits to your aerobic fitness can be huge. However, that does not mean that it's going to be high risk, okay? It's just a fantastic way to get some training in. Now, there are going to be sessions which are low risk and low reward in isolation. However, when we step back and look at the bigger picture of your training over the week, the month, the year, it really starts to add up. And those are your sort of steady state zone 2 endurance sessions. A 1 hour run for most people, most triathletes, is going to be quite achievable. It's not going to leave them too tired. It's not going to have a huge benefit in isolation. Okay, it might make you 0.01% aerobically fitter, but if you keep putting these in month after month, year after year, that's how somebody really becomes a great runner. So it's worth considering where somebody sits on this sliding scale between risk and reward. And because it's not a static scale, it depends on the athlete, their proximity to the race. There's a huge amount of different factors at play here. Now, as an example, I remember when I was doing one of my courses, the Ironman University certification that I did, one of the coaches, I'm not going to name them, it seems a bit unprofessional, even though they did say it on the record. They were talking about how to deal with athletes with injuries. And they said, look, if somebody gets an injury, in the week or two approaching the race, what you can do is, a week out from the race, get them to do this track session. And if they manage to nail that track session, you'll be fine. You don't need to worry about the injury. But what if the track session doesn't go well? What if the track session makes the injury worse? What if by giving somebody the track session, you actually stop them from being able to even start the race? Now, this coach has worked with, various professional athletes, and maybe they do need to have that approach to their race, really. Maybe it would be ideal for them to be able to know going into a race whether they're going to be able to run the marathon or not. If it's somebody's first ever Ironman, I can't really be giving them this high intensity track session a week out from the race, which is a questionable decision anyway. To make or break it, basically. Either I'm going to break you with this session and you're not going to do your Ironman, or we're going to be fine. And the reality is that by doing that track session, okay, there may be a small benefit to performance on race day, but if it's their first Ironman, chances are that a high quality track session isn't going to do a huge amount for them ahead of their first race, because the marathon is going to be a war of attrition between slow running and walking. But the only potential reward from doing that track session is the peace of mind of knowing that you're probably not going to have that injury. However, for me, this one just totally does not add up. That confidence, it would be nice to have that confidence, to know that somebody has that. And okay, if somebody be looking at incurring a bunch of extra costs, like they haven't bought flights yet or accommodation, if they left it all really to the last minute, and they don't know whether they should go or not, they can't wait and they can't fly out there, do the swim, do the bike, and then get 500 meters into the run and think, I can't do this, okay? That's probably not going to make sense for them financially, but most Ironman athletes are sensible enough to book everything in advance, and actually just having that extra week of rest on this potential niggle/injury is going to be a much better way to handle that. But again, I don't coach professional triathletes. Now, if you're a professional triathlete, and I'm talking about the kind of professional athlete here who really wants to be or is right at the forefront of the sport, there are plenty of professional triathletes who are much better athletes than I'll ever be, but they're almost accidental pros who just raced really well, had a fantastic day at a regional championship and got an email from their local governing body or Ironman saying, would you like to take your pro card? And they thought, why not? This could be a great adventure for a year or two. If, however, somebody is looking to win world championships, if a professional is looking to be right at the pinnacle of the sport, they have to take these high risks, because without these high risks, they won't be at the front. They're not going to be able to achieve their potential as an athlete. Now, what they have in their arsenal is they have several years, maybe even decades in some cases, of training history, and they know which kind of sessions they're going to respond well to, the kinds of sessions that are going to leave them with a higher risk for injury. They have this huge history that they can look back on and make decisions based off of. So it really is beneficial for them to be able to take these risks, because they need to. It's their job. However, if you are an amateur athlete, if you've invested a huge amount of time and money into this one event that you're training for, okay, you can't afford to take a lot of high risks that could leave you with an injury, leaving you unable to even take the start line of this event. I should point out that you don't necessarily need to take high risks to end up injured. It can just be something that's slow and develops over time. It could be that it's simply a muscle imbalance that you didn't know that you had until it was too late and this injury appeared. I'm not suggesting that if somebody gets an injury or somebody overtrains, they necessarily made a mistake as such. That's not always the case, but there is, especially with the overtraining aspect, there is definitely a learned element of trial and error and understanding your body to help you, even if you do end up in one of these pitfalls, to prevent that from happening again in future. Okay, let's get into the juicy stuff. Let's look at individual sports, and we're going to start with swimming. Now, I'm going to start out by saying that by and large, swimming has the lowest risk of any discipline. Now, don't get me wrong, it's perfectly possible for you to end up injured and overtrained from swimming. Shoulder injuries are going to be the vast majority of issues that swimmers suffer with. However, this is something that we need to sort of keep in perspective. Again, the chances of developing a shoulder injury, if we're keeping up our strength work and we're being sensible with the sessions, is relatively low compared to picking up a lower limb injury such as Achilles tendonitis or a calf tear or something like that. Now, some low risk but high reward sessions could include simple endurance sets, so swimming 2.5, 3, 4 kilometers. Just getting that time in that steady state nice and easy is going to provide us with a good aerobic base, and just time in the water, which is really essential for swimmers, just turning those legs and those arms over in the pool. Also, technique sessions are very low risk, but if you like, sometimes I will give people sessions where they're simply swimming 50-meter blocks, resting for 30 seconds, and then swim another 50 meters. And we repeat this for sort of 500, 750, 1,000 meters. There's incredibly low risk, but for the new swimmer, there is a lot of reward from them focusing simply, rather than trying to swim as far as possible, on trying to swim as well as possible and keep an eye on their technique. Now, of course, there needs to be education surrounding this. Somebody needs to know what good swimming technique is. Ideally, they need to know what kind of areas it is that they should be working on. But drills are all well and good, but simply focusing on some short intervals on the best technique that we can possibly have is going to bear more fruit than simply doing endless drills. However, we will want to be doing some other sessions that sit outside of this low risk, high reward spectrum, which is the ideal place to be. But we do want to sort of work other elements of our stroke, which are going to come with inherently more risk. So if we take the example of swim paddles, if we are swimming with paddles, that is going to increase the risk of shoulder injury. Relatively well accepted fact. If you're increasing the surface area on your hand, if you're increasing the load placed on the shoulder, then you are going to increase the risk of shoulder injury, which is why you do need to be careful when you're introducing paddles into your training. Now, I know that there are studies out there which say that, you should never do, well, not studies, but, advice by coaches who say, you should never have more than 20% of your session volume made up by paddles. but I have some athletes of mine swim about sort of 1,500 metres with paddles and pull buoy, splitting up into intervals. The reason being is that I personally know as a coach that they can handle that. They don't have a history of shoulder injury. We're doing all the prehab work in the gym, and we have slowly increased the volume with the paddles, and they've reported no issues. So why shouldn't we be able to take on this high risk, high reward session? It's not like we do it very often, but it is fantastic for somebody developing their upper body strength. So we do need to at least, entertain doing these sessions. Now, when it comes to sessions that are high risk but low reward, I can't really think of many training sessions as such. However, if somebody is on holiday and they think to themselves, oh, you know what, I fancy a sea swim, and they have no idea about the water, they have maybe very little understanding of rip currents, and they don't know sort of where there are rocks on the surrounding coastline. They go out for a swim where they haven't got any friends or family who are keeping an eye on them. This is the kind of session which is high risk and low reward, because the best case scenario is they get another 2.5 kilometre swimming. The worst case scenario is they get dragged out to sea, smashed across the rocks. They could even be sort of injured by some wildlife in certain areas. That's really the only situation where I go, look, it's just not worth it. Again, potentially maybe even in really cold water. If somebody is not conditioned to cold water swimming but decides that they want to get in, when it's about sort of 9 degrees and they get in and they go out to swim a 400 metre loop and they get sort of 200 metres in at the furthest point from shore and they start shaking uncontrollably and they're really clearly getting hypothermic, then, we do have ourselves, a bit of an issue there that could land ourselves in a fair bit of trouble. But generally, it's more environmental issues that are going to provide the highest risk in swimming rather than anything that we really do in the pool. I guess, certain activities you do in the pool, such as diving into the shallow end and, silly things like that, I guess that those could be argued. But from a sort of a triathlon training perspective, I really don't think there's a huge amount in swimming that you need to avoid, like it's the plague, unless, that's assuming that you are perfectly well adapted to it and your training is built up towards doing that kind of work and you haven't just dropped something huge out of the blue. Next up, I'm going to move on to cycling. So cycling as a sport, I think has the, talking about road cycling here, I think it probably has the highest risk when it comes to, generic harm that we can sort of do to ourselves in training simply from falling off a bike. Now, I hate to break it to you, but if you ride a bike for long enough, you are going to fall off it. I think it's been about 6 or 7 years since I've come off. Part of that is due to me not doing quite as much outdoor riding as I used to. I've stopped sort of riding outdoors in winter if the temperature is sort of just above freezing, because, for me it's not worth the risk of washing out on some black ice. But, you're going to misjudge something. You could go around a corner a little bit too fast, you could hit some gravel. There's all sorts of things that could happen when you're out cycling that could leave you banged up and bruised. So there's always going to be this level of risk when it comes to riding outdoors. Now, we can reduce that risk by riding indoors. I know a lot of people who swear by this. They will do very little riding outdoors. Not so much because of the risk factor, although there can be. And look, I get it. If you were out riding on the road and a car just ploughed into the back of you, I can totally see how that would completely shatter your confidence, and that you may well say, you know what, I'm going to do all my riding indoors, and you know what, I'm not going to tell you, oh, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. It's going to take a while to get your confidence back. I've stacked it at speeds, doing close to 30 miles an hour on a downhill. Somebody in front of me, well, at the front of the groups, apparently somebody's used to riding motorbikes. And we were on a main road and we approached a side road. Now, apparently, what you do if you're riding motorbikes is when you approach a junction, you slow down a bit. I mean, I'm guessing that, a lot of motorcyclists are probably going above the speed limit. I know that's a generalisation, but a lot of motorcyclists on a country lane will be going above the speed limit, and they'll approach a junction and will very wisely slow down because they think this car may not appreciate how fast I'm moving and may pull out on me. Anyway, got a bit diverted there. So we were approaching this side road that was coming out where we were going downhill at about 30 miles an hour, and this person brakes because he wants to slow down ahead of this junction in case a car pulls out. And this triggers a chain reaction in the bunch with, people sort of swerving around him, having to slam on their brakes. I'm at the back, minding my own beeswax, and I suddenly see this rider in front of me, and she just goes over her handlebars. And I remember seeing her flying over her handlebars, and then I don't remember much apart from finding myself in the road. And when I came out of, when it sort of, I came to, and I don't think I lost consciousness. Maybe I did briefly, but when I was there, and I realised what had happened, and I sort of crawled to the side of the road. I'd landed pretty much face first. I've still got a scar under my nose from it. I imagine I just went over my handlebars. It's the only reasonable explanation. But it took me time to come back from that. It really did. I remember the next day I was moving house, and I rode my bike from my old house to my new house, which is only about 1,500 metres. Partly out of a sense of defiance of I don't want to lose my confidence. I'm not going to let this break me. But realistically, it took me a long time to get my confidence back cycling downhill. And you know what? I've never quite become as confident riding downhill. Now, I had this crash when I was, I think, sort of 24, 25. I'm 36 now. So yeah, it was over 10 years ago. And, guess what? I'm a bit more sensible. I've got a greater sense of self-preservation in my 30s than I did in my 20s. So, I'm not going to be dropping downhill like a rock like I did. But it's totally understandable that if somebody loses their confidence when out riding on the road, might want to do most of the training indoors. However, we do still need to appreciate, look, if we're going to be racing outdoors, we probably should get at least a little bit of time out on the roads to build confidence in our handling and our bike handling skills, because the more sort of skill that we have when handling our bike, cornering, braking, obviously you wouldn't be in a group in an Ironman, but you would still be a triathlon, unless it's it could be draft legal, I suppose, but they're very rare. But you still be passing other riders, and that it just helps to have these road smarts about you. And we can't ignore riding outdoors, because we're just going to end up with a higher risk of coming off our bike in the race if we don't do any riding outside in our training. Now, pretty much all of the risk that we're going to be encountering on the bike, for the most part, for most athletes, is going to come from sort of coming a cropper on a corner, having an accident, falling off the bike. The amount of injuries that people obtain when cycling is relatively slim. I'm not saying that it never happens. Of course, you can get people who have knee pain. You can have people who end up with with sort of different sort of, I'd say, more sort of minor ailments that wouldn't necessarily stop them completely from riding, although sometimes it would. But it's not quite as bad as running, or I guess like shoulder injuries in swimming, where suddenly bang, that's it, you can't train in this sport any longer. You're less likely to have that in cycling, unless, of course, you do fall off your bike. So rather than looking at individual training sessions and the risks that they pose, I'm going to instead look at different riding sort of behaviours, different styles of riding, who you ride with, those kinds of things, which are actually going to have a larger impact on sort of our risk-reward ratio that we're asking ourselves here. So one example, actually, before I get started, which is a bit of an outlier here, there was a client of mine who I was training for Ironman last year, and he travels an awful lot with work. He's an executive at a company, and we just didn't get the bike volume in ahead of the Ironman that we wanted. It wasn't that he didn't do the work, it wasn't that he was making excuses, it was quite simply that he didn't have the time. He simply was too busy travelling and with work to get in these long sessions. And then he has a period of very little travel, and I think the Ironman was about like 2 months away. And he goes, look, I've got this window, and I know that we really need to work on the bike. And so I think I set him, that week we did a 3 hour ride, then a 3.5, then a 4, then a 4.5. We really ramped up the volume on the bike a lot faster than I normally would. But what choice did we have? You can't go into an Ironman with a sort of 3.5 hour long ride. So I really jamped up the volume, and he came back, and he had a bit of a knee injury. Now he managed to get through the race. He was fine on the run. It was just on the bike that it was quite painful, but it was a risk that we needed to take. It was high risk, but it was also high reward. So if we didn't take that risk, then there's a good chance you wouldn't be able to complete the event. So increasing the volume quite rapidly like that is going to be sort of the only real risk that you're going to have from a training aspect. I guess you could say that if somebody does like very low cadence work, if somebody is riding at sort of 50, 60 RPM in an effort to increase their torque at that range. Now, I've never personally believed in that kind of training. I'd always much rather my athletes ride up hills. But I know that some coaches prescribe it. So if you're doing this really low cadence work, then you do have the chance of something going ping a bit more, because there's simply more load going through the muscles with each rotation. But for most cyclists, we are simply looking at how we ride the bike rather than the exact wattages, intensities, as it were. So the biggest risk factor for me, personally, has been group riding. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all group riding is dangerous, but the only times that I've had I've fallen off my bike, really, have been on group rides. And it's always been a case of somebody crashing in front of me and bringing me down with them. And there comes a point, actually that's a lie actually. There was one time where we were riding along, somebody didn't point out a pothole, I hit a pothole, we were riding quite fast, okay, it was a big hit, and we were doing about 40k an hour. We slowed down to about 30 to go around this corner, and as I corner, my wheel just completely washes out and I go down hard. And it turns out that I got a pinch flat when I hit that pothole, and I went into a corner at 30 kilometers an hour with no front tyre, which is predictable results. But yeah, generally speaking, it's been poor riding by other riders that's caused me injury, which is one of the reasons why, as much as I'm an advocate for going out and riding with friends and in social groups, that as triathletes, we do need to do a good chunk of our time riding solo, if only to reduce the risk of being caught up in any kind of accident which isn't actually our fault at all. Now, the group that you ride with does make a difference, as does the speed that you're riding at, the competence of other riders. There are a huge amount of factors. Now, I'm sure there are a huge amount of cycle groups out there, that are completely safe to ride in, and occasionally I will still ride in a group, but I won't be right on somebody's wheel, putting my faith in them and their ability to stay upright. Because for me, it's just it's low reward, but it's high risk. I don't really gain much from riding in a group, apart from the social aspect, which, don't get me wrong, it is important to have an element of that, which I still do occasionally, but it's not worth the risk. If I go out and do a ride in a group, I know the chances of me crashing are much higher than if I go out on my own. So the more time that I spend riding in a group, the more likely I am to crash. So I do need to be a bit more mindful of this when I'm choosing how it is that I ride. Now, as to riding behaviours that myself or people that I might be riding with undertake, this is the real risk factor rather than simply being in a group, most often it's cornering. So it will be, as people come around a corner, it could be that they're going too fast, it could be that they take the wrong line, it could be that their tyres are obviously my tyre wasn't up to scratch when I crashed in that group. partly because it was empty of air, which I find is a bit of an issue. And it's quite often corners where people will come a cropper. The second one is potholes. Now, there is a general etiquette when you're riding in a group that you point out potholes when you see them, both with a hand. So you point at the pothole and you'll shout hole or pothole or something like that to help other riders avoid it. The idea being that everyone then, that message then goes back through the group. So if the rider in front of you shouts hole and points at hole to the left, you would then do the same so the rider behind you sees that. It's if somebody doesn't see a pothole. Now, I've done this before. I've been on the front of a group. I'm not going to suggest I'm perfect. And I've completely missed a pothole because I am chatting to someone or my mind's elsewhere. And before I know it, I'm about 6 feet away from a pothole and I just shout hole and brace myself for hitting that pothole. But at least the people around me know that there is a pothole around and they can, hopefully look around. They stand a better chance of avoiding it than if I did nothing. But hitting a pothole, ending up with either a puncture or occasionally somebody coming off their bike because of that is another risk factor. Now, whether you are riding solo or you're riding in a group, descending is going to be a risky time to be on your bike. Now, again, it doesn't have to be inherently dangerous. However, the level of risk that you take is going to have a real impact on your chances of staying upright or coming off. Now, as I alluded to earlier, if you crash when you're going downhill, it is going to hurt more than if you're on the flat. You're simply traveling at a higher speed, and that risk is there. And I don't want to put people off riding downhill. Again, it's only this one issue that I've had in, 13, 14 years of road riding. I've only ever one crash on a downhill. But the reason I've only had that one crash is because I don't push the limit on the downhills. Okay, I like build up my confidence over time. When I first started out, I was really quite tentative on the downhills. Got faster and faster, more and more confident. And then I had that big knockback in confidence after that crash. But I just became more comfortable in my ability to sort of handle a bike on the downhill. And it does also depend on how well you know that hill, but you should always bear in mind that you never know what the conditions are going to be like on that given day. It may be that the hill is normally absolutely fine, but somebody dropped some oil on it recently and you can't see it until you're on top of it. So, don't get too confident. Don't ever go around a corner thinking, oh, cars never come up here, and go wide around that corner and then end up being thrown across somebody's windshield. I don't want that. But, if you know the climbs, if you understand your bike, you get better at braking, you can afford to take more risks, but you should always remain in that sort of that space of I could stop in time if I needed to, if a hazard appeared. Which for me is the most important thing. Now, you may think to yourself, if you're in a race, oh, you know what? I'm gonna push the limit here because I know that there's nothing coming the other way. Well, what if there's an ambulance with another rider in it who's just had a serious crash that's coming round on the other side of the road? All Ironman events, closed roads events, they will have either the left or the right lane, depending on which country you're in. The lane that you're not allowed to ride in will be for emergency vehicles, for support vehicles, for referees, all of that. You can't afford to play around with these. So, always make sure that you're riding within yourself. Never make any assumptions about what is or isn't going to be around that corner. And just look after yourself, because if I were to absolutely, if we're looking at sort of a descent that would take me about 2 minutes to ride down, if I really leaned into every corner, if I really pushed the limits of my grip on my tyres and I took some chances because I really wanted to maximise all the time that I could get going downhill in a race, down a 2 minute descent, I might save 5-10 seconds. Is that really worth the risk of coming a cropper and your race completely ending, you breaking your bike and being lying in a bloody mess on the tarmac? No, it's not. Okay, so when you are riding downhill, please, please, please don't take unnecessary risks. Okay, I do want you to get to the point where you're not riding the brakes the whole way down. I thought to myself when I first started riding in a group, oh, I'm quite good on the downhill, despite the fact I was quite light. Transpired that I was one of the few people who didn't go downhill with the brakes on in some way, shape, or form constantly. Okay, you do need to get over that fear of going fast, but realistically, you can go around about like 25 miles an hour, that sort of 40, 45, maybe up to 50 kilometers an hour on the downhill if you have a set of working brakes relatively safely. By the time somebody gets to 60, 70 kilometers an hour, then you are really looking at like, okay, you really need to know what you're doing. You really need to know your bike and understand how it works before you start hitting those speeds. But I want you to be going significantly faster than you are on the flat when you are going downhill. Just don't take unnecessary risks. Now, this is one of those areas where road cycling and triathlon differ. If you go out riding with road cyclists, as I did, they will make more of a thing about how fast it is that you go downhill or around corners. Okay, if you were participating in a bike race, those 10 seconds that I alluded to losing over a 2-minute descent could be absolutely huge. Okay, if it means that you fall off of a group and you find yourself in no man's land with nobody to draft, okay, you are going to lose time hand over fist. If you're in a bike road race, you do need to stick with that group if you want to remain in contention. However, we are triathletes. We are essentially riding a solo time trial. Now, a lot of triathletes are, I'm sorry to say, god-awful bike handlers. Really poor, especially on the downhills. Although some of you may know Martin Brunt. I had an exchange with him on Twitter a few years ago before Twitter became really toxic. And he's saying that he got he was riding Ironman Nice, I think it was, going down a mountain descent, and this guy blares past him, shouting at him for holding him up on the hairpins. And this guy then overtakes Martin and then goes straight ahead of the hairpins and ends up having a gentle landing off of the bike after overshooting the hairpin. This guy just rides past, sort of chuckling to himself. So if you are on a course with a long descent where there's a lot of downhill, then pushing the limits you can make some time up there, but realistically, unless you really know what you're doing, unless you really know the descent, if you have practiced it in training, you can't afford to take these risks. They're just not going to pay off for you 9 times out of 10. Touching on this, I know it was a bit light-hearted previously because the athlete was uninjured, but I have seen a lot of issues when I've been out, especially on race courses. I don't know if any of you have ever ridden any of Ironman Bolton back when it was held up there on sort of the hillier course. They reworked the bike course for the 70.3, but back when it was this sort of really grizzly, hilly bike course, I did it in 2019, and I remember coming round, some corners, and there were paramedics on the floor treating what looked like, unfortunately, a pretty serious crash of somebody going into a dry stone wall. And it was a corner that it came out, and it's one of those corners that you come into it and you think, oh, like it's a nice left-hand turn. But then it tightens and it tightens and it keeps on going. And what they'd done is they'd come into that corner with too much speed, and the corner kept tightening up and going around, and in the end they just went flying into this dry stone wall and clearly hurt themselves, and their race was undoubtedly over at that point. And this was about sort of 25, 30 kilometers into the 180. It's very easy when you're on a closed road to think that you're invincible, that you can afford to take more risks, but this just isn't the case. It's just as dangerous as riding on an open road, really. You never know what else is going to be coming around the corner, as I alluded to earlier, and especially if you don't know the course. Now, what I will do if I am on a descent quite often, especially if it's a longer one, if I sort of coming down some Welsh mountains, for instance, I will take my GPS and I'll switch to the map view and I'll zoom out so I can see the corners ahead of me. Okay, right, I know that I've got what's essentially a hairpin right-hand turn coming up. Then I've got a long straight. Then I've got a gentle left-hander that goes straight into a tight right-hander. I've got an idea of exactly what the road is doing in front of me, which doesn't cause me to take risks, but it just allows me to go into the corners with a bit more confidence. than I would if I was riding completely blind. So the takeaway from this is please don't throw yourself into corners. Try to find the upper limit of the grip of your tyres, especially during an Ironman, where, okay, that guy who went flying around those corners, he could have made up maybe 2 to 3 seconds by riding in that high risk way, but he didn't. He ended up crashing out. That is an extremely high risk, incredibly low reward situation. And I get it, they were excited, they were on this beautiful course, and it could be that it was their first Ironman and they're just really excited. It could be they're a seasoned Ironman competitor and they wanted to put in the best time possible. But they hadn't sort of done a recce of the course. They didn't live locally, which is fine. I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to do that. But what I did do when I took another athlete up there in 2021 is the day before we hopped in my car and we went out for a recce on the bike course, and I pointed out to him all of the most dangerous corners so that he could spot them and we could work out exactly where they were and the best way to avoid them. If you do have a car, this is a good thing to do. This is just an extra tip. If you can drive the course the day before, that's the best way to do it. Please don't go out and think, oh, I'll ride the course. That's a terrible idea. It could be, I've certainly had it with athletes before where if they go out somewhere where they've got a large climb, that they might go and they might scout out the climb on the bike, the first climb that lasts about 5 kilometers, just so they can get an idea of how long it is, how it works, how steep it is, any corners. And turn around at the top and they ride down it. If they on like the Thursday that they arrive, which they'll be fully recovered from that by the time they get to Sunday and have a better appreciation of the climb itself. So that local knowledge is important. If you don't have local knowledge, if you don't know the roads, okay, at the very least have the map view open on your cycling computer if you have one, to give you an idea of how tight, how winding the corner is. If you have none of that, just go into every corner thinking this could get really tight. This could be a very different corner to the one I imagined, so you don't end up sharing that same unfortunate fate as that other cyclist. I do know that he made it because nothing like that was announced, but it did look like a nasty one. Something else we do need to consider when we're out in training, at least, is how we sort of ride on the road around junctions, cars, other road users, pedestrians, all of that. Now, I am a really strong advocate of cyclists sort of riding almost as if they're driving a car in many respects. You know, you observe all the rules of the road, you don't take risks, you give way to people when you should. This is just going to help keep us safe. I rode through London commuting and all this for, I think, 10 years. And I never once ended up in a crash. The closest that I came was when I was riding along a cycle lane and an ambulance came by and a van just sort of pulled left without checking that I was there, and I kind of banged my shoulder into the van where I could see what it was doing, but managed to keep myself upright. That was the only crash that I ever had. Well, altercation I ever had, because I was always cycling very defensively. I was always looking ahead to what it was that was happening up the road. I was checking over my shoulder before I made any change of direction. I stopped at every single red light the entire time that I was there. I just rode sensibly. And this is really important for us because this, our ability to sort of not be hit really is the primary sort of concern when it comes to our risk of reward ratio when we're out cycling. I always encourage people, when I do set people sort of harder outdoor workouts, I say, look, please, no matter how deep you're into an interval, no matter how hard you're riding, don't give yourself race brain. Don't take risks when it comes to pulling out on cars at T-junctions or roundabouts, okay? You still have to remember that these people are largely idiots behind the wheel, and you have to ride as such. If you assume everyone around you is an idiot, then you're not going to be caught off guard. And the last thing I want to do is for somebody to be following a workout of mine and find themselves knocked off because they were more worried about their power number than they were about staying safe, okay? Safety, following the rules of the road, comes first every single time. I know there is an element of luck here as well. I know that people do get knocked off their bike for doing absolutely nothing wrong. And oftentimes there's nothing the cyclist could have done differently. But from our perspective, the things that we can control, it is riding legally, riding courteously, getting ourselves out of danger where necessary, and sometimes riding defensively means actually riding closer to the centre of the road to stop other cars from coming past you. If you're approaching a narrow bit, coming up to a traffic island or something, and you get the feeling that someone might try and squeeze between the traffic island and you, putting you at risk, you do have to pull out slightly more centrally into the road, not slap bang in the middle. Just pull out far enough so that they can't get past, and just sit there for a while, and then once you pass that hazard, move back out again. Now, the rewards for not following the rules of the road are so small they can hardly be measured. You need a microscope to measure them, especially in training. Okay, we might end up having, a Strava PB, or we might end up with a slightly higher average speed if we ride recklessly. But realistically, it's not going to be anything that's going to make a difference to our performance on race day. It's just going to be the sort of a chance for a cheap thrill, and that is not something that I encourage athletes to focus on or think about. Really, I am much more interested in that long-term part of training and making sure that we get home from that ride safe. Now, I should at this point make a nod to off-road cycling. Now, off-road cycling can be safer, gravel riding, mountain biking, than road riding. You're certainly in a lot more control over what it is that happens, and what a lot of people don't like about road riding is the fact that they don't know what other cars are going to be doing. At least when you're riding off-road, you're largely in control of your own fate. However, I think sort of off-road riding, generally speaking, is more dangerous than road riding. Now, it depends on how it is that you approach off-road riding. As an example, there is an abandoned railway track near me. That's a bridleway. It's very flat, and I can ride up and down that bridleway, and it's almost like riding on a road. It is flat. It is there isn't much in the way of sort of uneven ground. It is almost like sort of riding on the road off-road, if that makes sense. It's long, it's straight, there's no corners. Now, that, and I see I walk my dog up there, I see lots of people cycling along around about 10 miles an hour, under on that. That is very low risk. But if you were to do sort of what I sort of quote-unquote proper mountain biking, where you'd be going down hills, over tree roots, around corners quite fast, and maybe some little jumps, okay, this is inherently quite dangerous. If you miscalculate, there's a good chance you'll go into a tree, because these are more often than not held in forests. Now, I have to say, as far as objects that hurt to hit go, trees are just about up there. Trees don't give an inch when you hit them. Their root system is very well established. You are going to be the one that absorbs all of the impact in that situation. Nothing is going to be displaced through that object. It's not. I mean, I'd almost rather hit a car than a tree, to be honest. So you have to be very mindful, if you do off-road riding, of the increased risk of injury. Now, what are the rewards for off-road riding? Actually, I think they warrant the risk, as long as you don't get carried away. The improvements in bike handling, in bike confidence, the mix up of the different stimulus. You know what? I like it when my athletes go out and do some off-road riding. Now, it's not something I force down their throats. It's not something I'll sort of, you need to go out and you need to buy a mountain bike or a gravel bike to do this training because it's really important. It's not like that. But if somebody wants to go, especially during a recovery week, if somebody would rather go for an off-road ride for 2 hours rather than a road ride, you know what? That's absolutely fine. As long as we're not sort of 6 weeks out, 8 weeks out from a race, should be absolutely fine. If you do come off when you're riding, however, I really want you to make sure that you appreciate sort of what the risks are. Now, if you crash when you are riding on gravel, you can end up really tearing yourself up quite nastily if you do land just gravel really, or some rough off-road surface. Now, don't get me wrong, Sliding down tarmac is not nice at all. It is horrible, you get that road rash. However, if you come off at speed on a gravel bike, not only you're going to slide for less, let's be honest, but you are going to end up, if the skin does open up, if you do have those abrasions, you are going to run the risk of getting lots of dust and stones in there, which then need to be cleaned out quite quickly to avoid the risk of infection. Okay, it's not pleasant. You also have the chance, if you misjudge a corner, of ending up in stinging nettles, poison ivy, brambles, take your pick, some kind of plant that you don't want to be going face first into. So, as long as you approach off-road riding with caution, and you don't push the limits unless you really know where it is that you are, it's not inherently dangerous, and there are rewards to it. It's just something that's best enjoyed in moderation, if only for specificity purposes. Now finally, this brings us on to running. Now, as out of the three sports, as I think we all know, you are much more prone to injury when running than you are when swimming or cycling. There are all sorts of running injuries we can get: knee, hip, calf, Achilles, plantar fasciitis. The list goes on, unfortunately. And the best way to get around it is with enough strength and conditioning. Now, if you haven't got a copy of my Introduction to Strength Training for Triathletes course yet, I'm going to pop the link down in the show notes. Okay, I highly recommend that you include some supplementary training, and this course takes you through absolutely everything that you need to know to minimise the risk involved with run training as much as possible. But aside from strength training, we do just need to be mindful of the volume and, more importantly, the intensity of the running that we're doing. Now, volume is a massive determiner of running injury, don't get me wrong. That's why I'm very careful when I build up an athlete's run volume, to give the body time to adapt to all the stimulus. But I think the intensity is the larger part because of how it changes the biomechanics and the increased force that goes through the body when you're running at these higher intensities. Now, every run session carries a level of risk with it. It could be that a simple 1 hour easy run is the straw that breaks the camel's back and that sets off an injury, but chances are it's not that session on its own that caused the injury. It was just that we got a little bit carried away with the volume, and that was the result. However, I look at some different sessions here and the level of risk versus reward that they give. Now, we've already touched on sprint sessions, so I'm going to look at some other alternatives and different options. Now, I mentioned earlier that I do very little in the way of maximum sprint work. I will do it occasionally, especially, with younger athletes. I might be a little bit more, free and easy with these, but as athletes get older especially, I will be very cautious with these sessions. What is going to make a big difference, though, is hill reps. And these are one of my favourite sessions to give people, because they carry a low level of risk relative to sprints, but they give us an awfully big bang for our buck. They help improve our running mechanics. They help improve our VO2 max, assuming that the hill is of a sort of a suitable length, that kind of 2 to 3 minute mark for the most part. And they're a great way for us to get intensity with reduced impact going through the body, assuming that we're not doing hard downhill reps, assuming we're using the downhills as a recovery. Sessions that are often overlooked, but that give you a good solid reward for relatively low risk, are tempo runs, long tempo sessions. So where you're running at a uncomfortable pace for a prolonged period. Now, this is the kind of pace that a lot of people can hold for 5k, but this is generally at a half marathon race pace, and if we are looking to hold this for an hour, 90 minutes, an hour 45, maybe 2 hours, that is going to provide us with a huge boost to our muscular endurance. Now, this doesn't have much of a risk, actually, relative to going out for an easy run. It's more the different energy systems that it works, the muscular endurance it develops, rather than it is, a particularly hard session on the body. So from the sort of the injury prevention aspect, yeah, it's a relatively low risk. But unfortunately, if you do a lot of these, if you do push the envelope a little bit, if you are working quite hard, this is something which is going to increase the risk of burnout in the long run. Something which is low risk but high reward is running drills. And other areas, sort of technique bits which we can do to help us, think about how it is that our feet land, improve our mobility, improve the biomechanics of our running. As long as you don't fall over during them, they're actually a really good way to improve our efficiency. Now, speaking of running drills, I wanted to talk about track work because often running drills will be included in a track session. Now, track work is generally done at a pretty high intensity, so we are looking at either anaerobic or VO2 max for the most part. Anything longer than that, and people probably choose to do that on the road. But the running track is great if you are looking to do some sort of 200s, 400s, maybe up to 800s in a controlled environment at a controlled sort of rate. You don't have to worry about your GPS because you can simply use the markings on the track. And it's a good environment. Now, it's not something that I generally recommend people do a huge amount of. In the UK, at least, a lot of running tracks, they just make it difficult for you to visit them. It's difficult to pay to get on to use the track. Sometimes they're often in a level of disrepair as well. There's not a lot of funding that's gone into athletics in recent years, unfortunately. And it's not something that I want to say to people, hey, you know what, we need to go. We need to do this track session this week because somebody has to find the track, travel there, pay to get in. For the sake of doing a workout, they could probably do on a road anyway. However, whether we're doing a session on a track or we're running around a football pitch, whatever it is that we're doing, if we're doing this kind of high quality, high speed training, then there is high risk to this, but there's also a high reward. The risk coming from, just sort of the intensity, the level of the training that we're doing for a prolonged period, it is quite hard on the body, by which I mean it's really hard on the body. And it is a bit of a young person's game, these really brutal track workouts, especially if you're doing them with any regularity. I'm not trying to scare sort of older people off the track, just that you have to be mindful and listen to your body when you do go there. You can't just open the tank and go absolutely bananas like a young person might and see what happens at the end. Now, I do think they're really important for athletes who are stuck in a speed rut, athletes who just aren't progressing as much as they'd like to or have plateaued a little bit. So I would encourage you to go and to give track workouts a try, but just keep in mind how susceptible you are to injury, your age, your ability to recover, all of these, because if there's any kind of session that's going to leave you hobbling around for a week afterwards, then it's likely going to be a track session. The surface that you run on also has a definite impact on the risk-reward ratio. If you are doing longer runs, if you can do them on softer surfaces, on trails, that is going to have an impact on the level of risk that's associated with those long runs. If you are running, however, on trails that are quite technical, quite hilly, with rocks underfoot, then that pendulum does swing back the other way towards the risk, because if you were unlucky enough to come a cropper, then you are going to put yourself out of action for some time if you come down and hit yourself on a rock, for instance. Something else to consider with running especially, though cycling as well, when it comes to the risk reward is, well, how safe is the area you're looking to train in? I know there are a lot of areas that I wouldn't really want my girlfriend going out and running on her own at night through. And there are certainly some areas that I wouldn't ride a fancy bike through. I lived in London for 10 years after all. I know there are some areas where, you do, if you were to stop at some traffic lights and a couple of guys decided that they wanted your bike, they could probably have it, Don't think it happens that often, but I think especially e-bikes, if people are riding on isolated trails, there is a chance of somebody getting bike jacked off of that. So while it may not be an inherent risk to your performance, obviously you do still have to consider your safety in mind, because it is going to have an impact on your ability to train. And you need to go, okay, like, is there anywhere else that I can train which is going to be lower risk to myself personally, even if it means sort of driving somewhere or, going in a different direction, having someone come with me, something like that. We do need to sort of be realistic and pragmatic and look, there are all sorts of risks out there that we need to mitigate. Now, at this point, I do feel like I'm starting to ramble on a little bit. I think I've made my points pretty clear. So I'm going to tie this one up here. Thank you very much for joining me. If you have any further questions, my email is down in the show notes. We can also contact me if you're interested in coaching, and I've also got that strength and conditioning course to help reduce the risk of running training as much as possible. Wishing you all the best with the week of training ahead. Stay safe, and I'll see you soon.